Madam Meow's Culture Lounge. Hello and welcome to Madam Meow's Culture Lounge on Resonance 104.4 FM. I'm Anna Chen, and you just heard the Yellow River Concerto, Defend the Yellow River by Cheng-Zong, or played by Cheng-Zong. He's on the piano, and conducted by Adrian. That was played by the Slovak Radio Symphony Orchestra. Today, we're exploring some of China's scientific and cultural innovations and contributions to the world, and examining some of the ways in which China and Britain have interlocked. Helping me to do that in the studio are Elizabeth Lawrence and Paul Anderson, and of course the adorable Charles Shaar Murray. Around the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008, the London Mayor, Boris Johnson, claimed that the Chinese were incapable of original thought. Now, you've heard me go on about this before, but I've actually found the full quote here. He said, "Chinese cultural influence is virtually nil and unlikely to increase. Indeed, high Chinese culture and art are almost all imitative of Western forms. Chinese concert pianists are technically brilliant, but brilliant at Schubert and Rachmaninov. Chinese ballerinas dance to the scores of Diaghilev. The number of Chinese Nobel Prizes won on home turf is 0, although there are, of course, legions of bright Chinese trying to escape to Stanford and Caltech. It's hard to think of a single Chinese sport at the Olympics compared with umpteen invented by Britain, including ping pong. I'll have you know, which originated at upper-class dinner tables and was first called whiff-waff. The Chinese have a script so fiendishly complicated that they cannot produce a proper keyboard for it." Discuss. Was that provocative or what? That statement, of course, predates the charm offensive mounted by Boris on last year's trip to China, where finally made aware of China's progress in all manner of things, not to mention the tons of moolah seemingly sloshing about. He did a reverse ferret now to Boris Johnson and David Cameron. China is El Dorado, Shangri-La and ancient Rome all into one. So what we're going to be just discussing today, Paul and Liz and Charles, is was there any truth in what he originally supposed?
Well, I think that's really a rather controversial statement, but, you know, Boris loves to be controversial, so... I wanted to go back to the piano concerto, which came from the opening. I wouldn't say... Well, in some ways, the concerto is derivative, but I think it is a historical reason for that, for the closeness of when China was a proper communist country, and their links to the Soviet Union. Now, the guy who wrote the piece rewrote it actually while he was in the Soviet Union. It was originally a vocal cantata. And so the influences of what's kind of, you know, socialist realism are very discernible in this. It's a piece which is very easily accessible and which conforms to all the kind of diktats of the time, you know, as given by Stalin. You know, it should be accessible to the people, it should have a nice melodic line. So
that sounds quite reasonable to me, actually. Liz is a musician, and we're going to be going into this deeper later on, where we've got some examples that she's going to show us the difference between what's happening. So, you know, was he correct, though, to say that all the Chinese could do was copy rather than innovate? Because that's been something that I've recognised all my life, that, you know, whatever the Chinese do, it's a Xerox, it's a copy. Now, human history, it has to amount to more than a crude national chauvinism, and I'm really, really sort of loath to say, oh, well, this was brilliant and that was rubbish. All these things are cyclical. In recent years, the Chinese themselves recognised limitations in their ability to innovate, and they've welcomed an explosion in the literary genre of science fiction, as they noticed that the major heads of the big tech companies, such as Apple's Steve Jobs and Microsoft's Bill Gates, all read science fiction from childhood on. There's a conscious effort to stimulate imaginative thinking in their industries, and that particular solution, I think, is an impressively imaginative strategy in itself, if you're trying to get yourself out of that hole. So we have in the studio today Elizabeth Lawrence, a musician and a teacher who's been looking at Chinese musicians who play Western music, how they train, their approach, what their parameters are for virtuoso performance, and when does it veer off into what some might think is bad taste and what others think is daring and new. Paul Anderson, the author of Moscow Gold, takes us through the historical political upheavals of the last century that have returned China to top position as the world's leading technoculture. Plus, we have Charles Shaar Murray, my lovely assistant extraordinaire, breaking in every now and then like a voice from the heavens, doling out wisdom and good sense, and blowing the big fat raspberry of disdain when we get it wrong.
Greetings, people of this planet. We come in peace.
Yay. So first of all, we're going to hear some more music. I did play this before, but I love it. It's Lang Lang with Metallica. That was Lang Lang and Metallica playing one at the Grammys. I just love that. Liz, could he have done that a bit faster? Because he is, after all, supposed to be flashy. Was that flashy or
well,
what?
That was pretty flashy, actually. Quite difficult what he played. So in terms of technique, full marks to Lang Lang. Personally, I mean, of course it's great to sort of, bring genres together as they did at the Grammys, but from a purely artistic point of view, I would say it's not entirely to my taste, but on the other hand, it's also in a great tradition of, say, Pavarotti performing with Barry White. There's even a performance of Pavarotti with James Brown out there, which is just the weirdest thing ever.
Well, Metallica have in the past also collaborated with Lou Reed. I just think it's a shame that Lou was no longer available to join in with this one, because I think Metallica, Lang Lang and Lou Reed would have been a cultural mashup of wondrous proportions.
Oh, shame we'll never see it. Okay, we know the list. Hydraulics, gunpowder, paper, the movable type printing press, the stirrup, silk, ceramics, tea, money, mathematics, horticulture, and in the last century, microsurgery. These are some of the skills, industries, tools and commodities pioneered by China over hundreds and thousands of years. Francis Bacon died not knowing that the three inventions he regarded as doing the most to give birth to the modern world out of the feudal, paper, printing and gunpowder, were Chinese in origin. The Industrial Revolution of Great Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries changed the world, but it was only made possible by advanced techniques in agriculture which freed up land labour and fed it into the industrial leviathan. So where did these advances in agriculture come from? In his book, The Genius of China, 3,000 Years of Science, Discovery and Innovation, Robert Temple scours the archaeological, pictorial and documentary evidence to produce a comprehensive list of inventions that went global. Sometimes these innovations travelled westwards, such as silk. Sometimes they were invented independently elsewhere, much later. So to give you an example, you're talking about the agriculture, the Chinese cultivation of crops in rows, well, that was going on in the 6th century BC, and the seed drill, that dates from the 2nd century BC. That predates Jethro Tull's seed drill by about 2,000 years. I mean, that was a breakthrough when at the beginning of the 18th century, when he devised a seed drill that was actually very, very fragile. Likewise, the iron plough with a mouldboard, introduced to Europe by Dutch sailors from the east and brought to England when the Dutch were hired to drain the East Anglian fens and Somerset moors. From the 4th century onwards, the Chinese were using a horse harness that put pressure on the sternum and skeleton rather than choking the horse by pulling at the throat. Without these, the European labour force would never have been available to be taken off the land and sent into the factories. I was amazed that even the basic design of the steam engine was Chinese. There was a rudimentary one in China that's been dated at 1551, as well as one in Italy in 1629. And also, Europeans, we were great seafarers. That's why we were able to, have all our empires. We were able to travel the seas due to the Chinese rudders the compass and other nautical methods of navigation, without which that journey to the New World might never have happened. I quite like the idea as a big laboratory of global cross-fertilisation across boundaries of geography and time, providing human beings with what we need to build a better world that benefits all the world's inhabitants. Well, I can dream. That's not too much to ask, is it?
Well, it was interesting that you mentioned Jethro Tull and the seed drill, because I have it on very good authority that the Chinese also pioneered the art of playing the flute while standing on one leg.
I do actually, if we've got time, I do actually, of course, have a Jethro Tull number lined up. So this is the big mystery. So China did all that in its early days. So how did one region, Europe, suddenly race ahead while China, an early starter in science and technology, falls so far behind? The historian and biochemist Joseph Needham thinks that one cause behind the ossification of the Chinese state was another of China's innovations, the bureaucracy. So here's irony. Right, 2,000 years ago, China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, he of the Terracotta Army, he so successfully crushed opposition among the warring states that he united them into one country. Qin destroyed the feudal opposition so that while British and European feudalism grew around a robber baron system, China developed a huge organising class that rose through merit and the exam system to run the state. So this is the world's first civil service. So that means that any big social project, such as building the Great Wall or constructing waterways, could depend on a large, solid social infrastructure. In its early stages, Needham argues that this meant that science could flourish and spread, so you had a lot of creativity happening that was supported really by the state. And he gives as examples a meridian arc survey covering 2,500 miles north to south, which measures the longitude of the ellipsoid of the Earth rather than the Earth being a sphere. Plus there was a scientific observation of the stars of the southern hemisphere, and this was adding to Chinese astronomical know-how. But in Europe, in feudal times, science fell on the sword of the short-term ambitions of the military aristocracy, and I have to say, it's feeling a bit like that now with the whole robber baron mindset running everything, and wondering how short-term that's going to be. However, all this was reversed around the time of the Qing dynasty. I'm going to bring Paul in to talk about this. In the 1640s onwards, really, when the vast, unwieldy bureaucracy grew stodgy and sclerotic, they lacked any thinking space, there was no wriggle room for creativity, and it began to strangle new ideas. And it's not for nothing that a common Chinese saying is, the nail that sticks up has to be hammered down. And wherever you see that dynamic entering society, you're in a downward spiral. So, I'm not talking about the British left or anything, but there you go. Some reckon that Chinese scientific advances were stagnating even earlier than this, by the time of the Ming dynasty, but certainly by the time the East India Trading Company set its sights on China's wealth in the 18th century. Productive forces released by the technological revolution and capitalism meant that the smaller, nippier adversary was able to win the day. Now I'm going to bring in Paul. Paul was reviews editor of the Tribune, editor of Tribune, deputy editor of New Statesman. He's written books on the Labour Party, Orwell in Tribune. His current book, Moscow Gold, The Soviet Union and the British Left, is published by ARG. It's very interesting. And he's currently working on a book that's very pertinent to today's subject. Welcome, Paul.
Hello.
So the way that politics affect, all these things are linked, aren't they? The politics and the science and the creativity.
Well, absolutely, because the story of China's falling behind is to do with the politics of China. It's under the Qing, particularly, it becomes a closed society, and that's as important as the conformism, the hierarchy, and the bureaucracy. It's no longer open to influences from outside, really until the early 19th century, when basically the British forced themselves upon the Chinese, through the first Opium War of 1839 to 1840. Subsequently, the relationship between Britain and China has been a rather interesting one.
But that was supposed to be the argument for the Opium War, where Britain mass-produced opium in Bengal and then forced China to take it at the point of a gun. There was a philosophical argument behind that, wasn't there? That it was about free trade.
Absolutely. The Opium War was partly about opium. In fact, that was what caused it. That's why it's called the Opium War. In fact, there are two Opium Wars, but the first Opium War was all about a Chinese attempt to clamp down on smuggling of opium, largely done by British traders. They grew it in India, in British India. Transported it to outside Canton.
But the reason this was important was because there was a hemorrhaging of bullion from the British Treasury, because the Brits liked, the silks and the spices and the tea especially so much, and China didn't have anything it wanted of made by Britain that it wanted to buy, to exchange. It meant that hard currency, hard bullion had to go out, and then it had to be changed into silver because China wouldn't accept gold. It needed, so the middlemen were making it. So it was a last-ditch effort, really, to preserve their British Treasury.
There's slightly more to it than that, although that's absolutely right. It's not simply that China didn't want anything from outside. The Chinese imperial authorities certainly didn't want anything from outside. What's more important, though, was that they wouldn't let anybody in. It was a closed society. It was closed to trade. The only way you could trade with China was by smuggling.
So shall we have John Crow, who was on the show last week? He, like Paul Anderson, was in the Steampunk Opium Wars, which we put on at the National Maritime Museum a couple of years ago. And here's John Crow as Lord Palmerston making the case for free trade.
The infuriated narco-capitalists-in-chief Jardine Matheson became the devil in the ear of Lord Palmerston.
The barbarian Chinese have no respect for property. Anyhow, opium is a mere incident to the dispute. The cause of war is the kowtow, the arrogant and insupportable pretensions of China that she will hold commercial intercourse with the rest of mankind, not upon terms of equal reciprocity, but upon the insulting and degrading forms of the relations between lord and vassal.
I fear you are correct. Commodities and trade, by such was empire made, to bring new order to old worlds, with rules to be obeyed, with dividends and bribes and coolies' pittance to be paid. There must be no impediment to commodity and trade. For in Bengal, Bengali maidens labour late beneath the moon, a milking of the poppy to feed the hungry spoon of the weary Chinese coolie, staggering his load beneath, who stops in at our opium den for a little light relief. But in Canton, an agent of the Qing, a certain Lin Se-Shu, has seized our chests of opium and burnt the buggers too. Trade impeded, commodities seized, something must be done. Our coolies demand nothing less than Her Majesty's government do forthwith annex Hong Kong. For your coolies, as fair as any Cockney fella. But if he don't get in his pipe, there'll be fireworks all over the old Pearl River, and heaven knows what civil strife. The Yellow Empire be washed away on a red tide of revolution. You mark my words, Master Lin. Then submit to a very British solution. Supply and demand, the capitalist keys to control the desires of the human. We supply the hard drugs. Your coolies do no more than simply demand and consume them. Everyone's happy, don't you see? You'll no longer need to cajole them. All chase dragon in harmony. The perfect way to control them. Oh, but Lin Se-Shu makes a hullabaloo. He takes our best British O and he burns it. Well, now it's his turn. If there's a lesson to learn, Lin Se-Shu's gonna be the one what learns it. Ha! We know he don't like how we British simply won't kowtow to his Confucius, he say, Chinaman laws. The man's beyond the pale. With God's help, we shall not fail. Gentlemen, this is war. Your Majesty, load the cannon. Come on, Your Majesty. Let's get you strapped up and shot up. Come on. There we go.
In fact, Lin Se-Shu, who was a local commissioner, didn't burn the opium for obvious reasons, because everyone would have been standing around inhaling deeply. He sprinkled it with lime, and I keep imagining with a slice of lime, squeezing it over it. But it wasn't that sort of lime, and seawater. He destroyed it. So it was interesting that the Brits wanted the fruits of China's advanced technology, the silks, the ceramics and the tea, and yet it's Britain's superior military technology that wins.
Oh, absolutely. The first Opium Wars is a small war, really, but it's a bloody one. And you're talking about industrial military technology against, basically not quite spears and junks, but it wasn't a particularly advanced. It was a rout, and the result was that the British could dictate terms to the Chinese, the terms included, first of all, China ceding Hong Kong, which of course Britain gave back only in the 1990s. 1997, wasn't it? Yes. But also, just as important, it got the right to trade in China through a string of treaty ports, which were, most important of them initially, Canton, now Guangzhou, I think is how you pronounce it, in Shanghai. What happened was that settlements, concessions were set up, which were ruled by the British on Chinese soil, where essentially British authorities established footholds for the empire. And these treaty ports, the British were the first, then various other imperial powers from the West and the Japanese set up treaty ports all the way through the 19th century, became an absolutely crucial part of the Chinese economy, for starters, but also a focus for Chinese nationalism and anti-foreigner feeling, which of course is massively important all the way through the 19th century and well into the 20th century. And they're crucially important right up to the Second World War.
Okay. And yet a lot of the communists and the Republicans, of course, they'd been educated in the West, though, so they were actually taking Western politics, Marx, Hegel.
Absolutely, but one of the things that they took from Western education was the notion of national self-determination, and the idea that these foreign powers should have, special rights on Chinese territory was something that was absolutely anathema to, a large number of Western educated nationalist intellectuals. It was also anathema to a large number of Chinese peasants who saw the treaty ports as an outrage, although they were just as outraged by the presence of Western missionaries in China, forcing Christianity down their throats.
And yet, the Taiping Rebellion, there would have been no Taiping Rebellion if Hong hadn't have discovered the
Absolutely.
Protestant, the Bible tracts.
Yes, the Taiping Rebellion, extraordinary story, lasts for 14 years, 1850 to 1864. Millenarian, incredibly violent, but motivated by a mystical quasi-Christianity among
But there was also, he did take seriously the thing about Jesus, being sort of more democratic and and kind, basically, because if you think the Hong's army, the Taiping army, was made up mostly of peasants, the lower orders. Women weren't allowed to have their feet bound anymore. So there was this. That you can imagine how that must have felt. That you've had for eons. You've had these awful dictatorial emperors, and suddenly here you are being told you have a soul, you have a value in the cosmos. It must have been intoxicating and liberating.
Well, absolutely, but also seen as a great threat by the imperial powers. The rebellion ended up being put down after the Second Opium War by force of arms, force of Western arms.
Yes, because despite the fact that the two countries the two nations were at loggerheads over the opium, the Brits suddenly unite with the Qing emperors in order to put it down.
Absolutely, and this sequence of events is very important in bringing China to the forefront in British political discussion. On one hand, the sheer brutality of the British and French intervention is something that horrifies liberal opinion in Britain. On the other hand, going to war again in order to defend the opium trade is something that disgusts more than just liberal opinion at home. So Christian moral reformers kick up a stink throughout the late 19th century about the immorality of
Gladstone, Cobbett.
Yeah, well, Cobbett's slightly early, but I mean he's first Opium War, if you like. But it's an immense literature from late Victorian England. About the horrors of the opium trade and the immorality of it. By no means all coming from the left, although from liberal point of view. Although, of course, this is a two-edged sword because the horror of the opium trade also feeds into a demonisation of the Chinese users of opium. This notion that the Chinese are lazy and degenerate, and
because of course before Britain mass-produced opium, it was an aristocratic vice that couldn't be afforded by that many, and then suddenly the country's flooded, and suddenly it becomes a national calamity as a widespread addiction.
Yeah. And in Britain, it becomes the subject of a real scare because we see from the 1870s onwards, small but significant community of Chinese in the East End of London in particular, later in Liverpool as well, big ports, and they're mainly sailors, lodgings, and social clubs and things like that. And of course, the sailors use opium. In the way that the Brits would drink beer, and
the aristocrats, of course, a lot of writers and aristocrats
leads to
here.
a gigantic moral panic about the opium craze among the Chinese, and how the Chinese in Limehouse
and the whole Yellow Peril thing.
Are corrupting
But you can see there's all this going on. I'm thinking it must affect the collective unconscious. If you are being walked over, if your nation, you belong to a nation that's being walked over, you are now being defined as subhuman. It must do something to the ability to create, because I can't imagine that there's a sort of, I don't know, I'm not saying that artists have to be happy, but I don't know, the conditions.
Yes, they do.
We'd like to. That's what we're striving for. Anyway, it's you're listening to Madame Meow's Culture Lounge on Resonance 104.4 FM. I'm Anna Chen, and in the studio with me are Liz Lawrence and Paul Anderson, helping me unravel what cultural and scientific contributions China has made to the world, and the lovely Charles Shaar Murray, helping me get through today, which is supposed to be a lunar eclipse, and a particularly heavy one. Not that we believe that here. We're astronomers rather than astrologers. Is that right?
Absolutely.
I know.
Absolutely.
He's nodding. Anyway, we're going to hear Lang Lang and JAHJA LING. So we've heard him already.
No Metallica this
No, we
time.
heard him with Metallica. Now this is Lang Lang getting more sort of down and serious about his music, and here he is playing that famous Rachmaninov Piano Concerto No. 2, the first movement. That was Lang Lang and JAHJA LING, Rachmaninov's Piano Concerto No. 2, the first movement. That reminds me of Marilyn Monroe in the 7-Year Itch, where, of course, that music featured quite heavily.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece, and I have to say that Lang Lang's interpretation of it really is great. I mean, Lang Lang is sometimes accused of being a little bit wayward, but, you know, he's an artist, he can make his choices. I mean, we'll come to that later, whether, you know, his sometimes waywardness is related to him being Chinese. All I wanted to say very quickly is Lang Lang has inspired a piano revolution in China. I think there's 40 million kids in China learning piano. I mean, that's a number.
Well, of course, that's Liz Lawrence, our very own Marilyn Monroe of the Resonance studio right now. Paul, so it doesn't look all bad, though.
Well, I mean, as the thing I want to emphasise is that the British reception of China isn't all Yellow Peril, Opium Wars and things like that. There's a great deal of sympathy, particularly with Chinese nationalism through the early years of the 20th century into the 1930s. So
because they got rid of their despotic dynasty, and they introduced some sort of republicanism.
Even before the declaration of the Republic, Sun Yat-sen, who's the first president, although he gives up the presidency in
1911, the Republic,
he's a bit of a hero for liberals and socialists in Britain. He studied here in 1896-97. He was actually kidnapped by the Chinese legation and rescued only by the skin of his teeth from being put on a freighter taking him back to Canton. But anyway, big public figure, and a great deal of hope for the Chinese Republic in 1911. Again, in the 1920s, you see, well, it's the result of the growth of Chinese nationalism. British imperial interests in the treaty ports are threatened. Or appear to be threatened, and the British send a force of 20,000 troops to Shanghai to defend the British settlements and British concessions. And there's a big peace movement in Britain, not quite as big as the one against the Iraq War, but nevertheless very significant. It's really one of the first occasions when you actually see an anti-war mobilisation on a large scale. In the UK, hands off China being the slogan. Again, in the 1930s, a big, largely the 20s hands off China thing was very much supported by just about everybody on the left. Just about everybody who was a liberal. So the Labour Party, the very tiny Communist Party, the Independent Labour Party, and so forth. During the 30s, there's a communist-led campaign in the UK, almost as big as the one in solidarity with the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War, Aid China.
Which was my dad was part of,
which has a great deal of influence, and indicative of this, one of the biggest non-fiction bestsellers and books of the 1930s was a book by an American journalist called Edgar Snow, called Red Star Over China.
Yeah,
which
we had that in our house.
Which my grandfather gave me a copy, but it was the first detailed account of the communists' long march when they escaped from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. I'm not going to get into all the detail of all of that, but it's a founding myth of the communist regime, and it's the first time really that one Mao Zedong is interviewed at length for an Anglophone readership.
But it all seems to be coming full circle, doesn't it? So there's this long period of historical struggle, and now we're seeing a period where the creativity is back. Liz Lawrence passionately believes that making music and art is a force for good and essential to life as a fulfilled human being. Her book on music education, A Parent's Guide to Music Lessons, was published by Bloomsbury, and she has worked in the creative industries ever since leaving the Royal Academy of Music. So, Liz, well, it's true, isn't it? The Chinese are using our musical scale, our musical score, our instruments, the opening number, the Yellow River Piano Concerto. I recognise the tune from my childhood listening to my dad's revolutionary records. But that orchestration is a Western form.
Yes, and I think in this sort of, globalised world, there's nothing wrong with taking anything which you like in many ways. And Western classical music, I think, is, a real pinnacle of civilization on the globe. Maybe not everybody agrees with that, but I have a very interesting quote here from a former Politburo member who was also Minister of Education on Chinese attitude to Western music. And that's a guy called Li Langqing. And he wrote a book sort of paying tribute to 50 Western composers, and he argues that one cannot be a true intellectual unless one understands Western classical music. Quite a sort of bold statement, really.
Well, there's everything in there, isn't there? There's mathematics as well. It's an art. It's it's not just an art. There is the scientific thing about it as well. It's like over, it's hundreds of years that it's developed and deepened.
Well, there is obviously a sort of great form and. There is mathematics in Western classical music. There's also mathematics in traditional music. I mean, say, for example, there's Bulgarian folk music, some of the East European folk music, which is heavily mathematical and has some very kind of complicated rhythms.
In fact, Chuck Berry used to be fond of saying that one of his methods for constructing lyrics was, if you have a 4-bar line, there are 16 beats in it, that means I can have 14 or 15 syllables and still have time to take a breath.
Very good point indeed. So to go back to sort of this, idea of, the Chinese are copying our stuff. Well, okay, it is not a kind of native art form to China, but I think that doesn't really matter. And I think we also need to look a little bit at the sort of historical context of the sort of very close links of China to the Soviet Union, as sort of, mentioned before. So this kind of whole ethos of, education and taking on, a Western philosophy to a certain extent, is very closely linked to that period, I think. So the Russians obviously have a fantastic classical music tradition. In fact, we'll hear Rachmaninov, we've just heard it.
And we can hear the
Prokofiev
in Lang Lang. Yep.
Exactly. But, so there's also a certain kind of, in the West, there's this sort of stereotype that Chinese musicians, particularly classical musicians, because it does take a lot of work, to master a classical instrument and to get to the top of your game. You've got to dedicate yourself for about 10 years, 3, 4, 5 hours a day, really.
Yes. Longer if you've got a tiger mother, apparently, so I hear. Wow. But shall we hear the Prokofiev Piano Sonata No. 7, third movement, played by Richter, who's a German...
Well, I know he is... he's a Russian pianist of German ethnic origin, but in my view, he's like the pianist of the last century.
Okay, thank you. Wow, I bet Lang Lang loved that. That's that rocks.
Yeah, I bet Pete Townsend had heard that when he wrote the synth intro to Won't Get Fooled Again.
But can you tell if something is being performed by an Eastern Asian artist or a Western artist? Is there a sensibility that comes through?
No, I don't think so. And actually a pretty good question, because we mentioned sort of tiger mothers earlier on and people being chained to their instruments. So this kind of slight Western stereotype, which I think is really fading, in fairness, is that, again, the Chinese are just copying and they're robots and they don't really understand because it's not really from their culture. I think these attitudes are really changing. And, they've produced Lang Lang. I mean, there's plenty of famous classical musicians which, grew up in the West. So
but just just in everyday life. I mean, it seems that how many pianos are they producing now? It's like a huge proportion of the world's pianos. Every family is musical in a way that really the Brits are no longer.
Well, I think that's partly because they have retained their music education system slightly more carefully than here. Because, there have been lots of changes. Don't get me started on this. We're running out of time anyway. But I think that's really to do with their own way of how they organise music education, which is very similar to Eastern Bloc countries, Eastern European countries. So they're still profiting to a very large extent from, I think, communist attitudes to education. I was going to say, Lang Lang also plays this piece, which is Prokofiev's 7th Sonata. It's actually also known as the War Sonata. And Lang Lang's version of this has been used as the intro for the video game of Gran Turismo, apparently. Not that I'm...
Hey, now you know what you've been listening to, what you've been shooting
so
them
Lang
down.
Lang is down with the Ute.
Yeah, and with Metallica.
He rocks.
So tell us about these next two pieces, Queen of the Night. You've brought in two different versions. Tell us about these.
Well, again, I'll just say one very quick thing about Lang Lang, because you said, can I recognise an East Asian performer or Chinese performer? No, basically. I can recognise a really good performer or someone who maybe isn't quite as accomplished as somebody else. The very quick thing I wanted to say about Lang Lang playing this piece, and we haven't got time to play it, is his take is not as austere and severe as Richter's, whereas Richter, what we've just heard, really, it's a machine. It's,
relentless.
Definitely relentless. It's going to war. Lang Lang is a little bit more playful with it at times. Now, I don't think that has got anything to do with nationality. That's just his own personal take on it. But I'm coming to the sort of next thing, and again, sort of contrasting two singers this time. First, we're going to hear Edda Moser, who's singing Queen of the Night, and we're going to contrast her with Sumi Jo, who is a Korean soprano and who's had a really outstanding career quite early on. She was sort of, big in the 80s and 90s, still around. She was discovered by Karajan, amongst other people, and she was one sort of really of the first East Asian performers to have had a truly global career in opera.
Do you want to hear the Sumi
No, let's have
first?
Let's have Edda Moser first, and then we'll...
Okay, Queen of the Night. So that was Edda Moser.
That was Edda Moser singing the Queen of the Night from Mozart's Magic Flute. And actually, let's hear Sumi Jo straight away so that we can...
Right, Liz, that was Sumi Jo, Queen of the Night, very sweet.
Yes. Now, the aria is really... The Queen of the Night is bidding her daughter, Pamina, to go and kill her father. So, quite a serious undertaking, and she is menacing her that she's going to disown her if she doesn't do it. Now, Edda Moser, as you can hear, pretty full on. I mean, I wouldn't quite go as far as saying, screams her head off, but, really goes for it. And... obviously has a different voice to Sumi Jo. Sumi Jo is sometimes accused of, sort of just singing very prettily and not quite getting it. Now, again, that's a slightly unfair sort of statement because Edda Moser and Sumi Jo just have very different voices, and Sumi Jo's voice is sort of just a little bit lighter. There are plenty of Western performers who would perform the Queen of the Night in, a much lighter and what you might call slightly sweeter version. But, particularly at the time, I did feel that, again, the sort of stereotype of, they don't really get it because of ethnicity was sort of levelled at her, slightly unfairly, I think. But, again, it's what type of voice you're born with, and absolutely 1000% compliments to Sumi Jo for actually singing perfect German.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting to see what this generation comes up with, because I think we're in for some real surprises here. Paul, you wanted to say something about, that original quote that Boris Johnson about whiff-waff and ping-pong.
Well, there's one sort of little known fact about Boris is to a certain extent right about ping pong being a British export to China. What he didn't say was that the person most responsible for exporting ping pong or table tennis from Britain to China was a communist admirer of Mao's regime, Ivor Montague, who was the chief of the International Table Tennis organisation, the name of which I've completely forgotten. He was a frequent traveller to China during the period when it was under the communists, pretty much closed to everyone apart from people on official trips. So that's the period really from 1949 all the way through to the.
So that's incredible. 80s. So it wasn't some sort of Bullingdon bully taking it out there, some officer class. It was a communist who took it out there, and then the Chinese went and whipped the world at ping pong.
He was a posh communist. He was not
a horny-handed son of toil.
Well, thank you. The horny-handed bit brings us to the end of today's programme. My thanks to Liz Lawrence, Paul Anderson, whose book Moscow Gold is out as an ebook. Next one is Paint the West Red. Charles Shaar Murray's brilliant collection of rock journalism, Shots from the Hip, is also out as an ebook from ARG Press. Liz, the name of your book again? It's a parent's guide.
It's a parent's survival guide to music lessons.
A parent's survival guide to music lessons. If you want to read more on the subject of China's scientific innovations, try to get hold of The Genius of China, 3,000 Years of Science, Discovery and Innovation by Robert Temple. Thanks to Tariq, yet again, for getting us through another week here. This is the penultimate one, last one next week. Madame Meow's Culture Lounge is repeated on Resonance 104.4 FM on Thursday morning at 5 a.m, or you can listen again on SoundCloud. All links at my blog, Madame Meow Says. I'm on Twitter at Madame Meow. Thank you everyone who listened. Next week, it's the last programme of this season of Madame Meow's Culture Lounge. Charles Shaar Murray concludes his guide through the blues with Part 3, The Women of the Blues. I'm Anna Chen, and this next one is, Liz, it's
a guy called Liao
Cheng-Zong, Comrade Goodwill, and that's followed by Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. Good night.